Tuesday, December 16th was supposed to be an ordinary night on Netflix. Then episode 4 of a new documentary rolled, and everything changed. Within minutes, viewers realized this wasn't another celebrity expose built for shock. This was something colder, heavier, final. 50 Cent's Netflix-backed documentary didn't raise questions in its closing episode. It connected them, quietly, methodically. And as the final chapter unfolded, the entertainment world felt the same unsettling shift. This wasn't storytelling anymore. It was consequence catching up. What made episode 4 hit differently wasn't volume. It was certainty. No dramatic voiceovers, no hype edits, just timestamps, uninterrupted footage, and first-hand accounts layered in a way that made denial feel unrealistic. Faces blurred, voices unsteady, details aligning across years and locations. The documentary didn't accuse Sean Diddy Combs. Outright, it did something far more dangerous. It showed patterns, and patterns don't disappear when the screen goes black. Before we go any further, answer this honestly. Do you believe 50 Cent released this documentary to expose the truth about Diddy or to force decisions the industry kept postponing? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want documentary-level breakdowns without the noise, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. As episode 4 unfolds, the tone tightens. Earlier chapters set context, but this final installment removes distance. Viewers aren't guided toward conclusions, they're confronted with alignment. Surveillance clips appear briefly, time-stamped, then fade. Audio recordings surface without explanation, then resurface later with context that lands heavier the second time. Witnesses speak carefully as if choosing every word matters because now it does. The documentary doesn't open by declaring wrongdoing. It opens by mapping how power functioned. Former insiders describe environments where access meant opportunity and silence meant survival. Not through threats, through routine, through normalization. The kind of control that doesn't announce itself but repeats until it feels ordinary, and repetition is everywhere. Different people, different eras, different cities. The same emotional details keep returning: confusion, pressure, fear of consequences. Accounts of private spaces that felt monitored, of situations that escalated without clarity. The documentary never labels these moments as crimes. It lets recurrence speak. And by the time viewers recognize how often the same dynamics appear, the question shifts from, is this real, to how long was this allowed? This is where 50 Cent's role becomes unmistakable. He isn't framed as a rival settling scores. He isn't positioned as a narrator chasing attention. He's shown as someone who understands timing. According to people close to the production, much of this material existed long before it reached Netflix. It wasn't released then because outrage fades. It was released now because scrutiny sticks. Episode 4 reinforces this through reaction, not commentary. Executives decline to appear. Lawyers speak in careful hypotheticals. Industry figures acknowledge concerns without naming names. This isn't panic, it's recalibration. And recalibration only happens when certainty disappears. As the episode progresses, the lens widens beyond Diddy alone. The documentary doesn't isolate him as an anomaly, it places him within a system. A network of people who benefited, people who stayed quiet, and people who quietly vanished from view. Careers that stalled without explanation, warnings that were never documented, conversations that ended abruptly. The implication is subtle but unmistakable. Silence wasn't accidental. It functioned. Then the documentary pivots without announcement into older, long-avoided chapters of industry history. Not speculation, not theories. Context layered against records, testimonies, and movements of money that never fully made sense in isolation. The film avoids accusations. Instead, it builds plausibility. And plausibility is harder to dismiss than rumor. Viewers begin pausing scenes, rewinding, matching dates, comparing interviews from years ago with what's now being shown. Moments once brushed off as coincidence feel aligned. The documentary doesn't claim to solve anything. It does something more unsettling. It makes previous explanations feel insufficient. And outside the screen, the reaction becomes part of the narrative. Social platforms don't just react, they analyze. Lawyers dissect clips frame by frame. Former employees post messages that stop just short of confirmation. Artists quietly distance themselves without explanation. Nobody makes definitive statements, and that's exactly the point. Silence, once protective, now feels exposed. This is where Rick Ross appears not accused, not defended, but positioned. The documentary doesn't linger on him. It doesn't need to. His presence functions as proximity to narratives, to power, to environments that now feel riskier in hindsight. Old statements about distance and independence replayed differently when placed beside new context. Not wrong, just incomplete. And incompleteness under scrutiny is dangerous. Legal analysts later explain why Episode 4 matters. Courts don't rely on spectacle, they rely on corroboration. And corroboration doesn't always arrive as one explosive revelation. It accumulates. Stories matching records, behavior repeating across time, environments producing the same outcomes again and again. The documentary doesn't declare this criminal. It shows why ignoring it became impossible. By the time Episode 4 reaches its closing moments, the viewer feels a shift, not outrage, not certainty, but unease. The sense that what's been shown isn't everything, but it's enough. Enough to move the story out of celebrity culture and closer to institutional attention. Enough to force response. Because the most unsettling realization isn't what the documentary reveals. It's what it implies still hasn't been fully addressed. This wasn't released to dominate headlines. It was released to force movement. And once patterns become visible, silence stops working. From here, the story doesn't get louder, it gets narrower. The moment Episode 4 ends, the documentary doesn't give the audience relief. It gives them momentum. Instead of closing the story, it tightens it. The focus shifts from what was shown to what those revelations force into motion. This is where the series stops functioning like a cultural event and starts behaving like a pressure system. Because once patterns are visible, institutions don't debate morality, they assess risk. And risk is exactly what begins to surface behind the scenes. In the days following the documentary's release, insiders describe a noticeable change in tone across the industry. Not public statements, not outrage posts. Silence, but not the comfortable kind. According to media strategists interviewed later in the series, this was the assessment window. The brief period where executives, lawyers, and partners determine whether a situation can be waited out or whether it requires immediate adjustment. The documentary captures this without dramatization. Emails appear on screen, redacted but telling. Conversations move from creative departments to legal ones. Meetings that were once routine suddenly include compliance officers. This isn't panic, it's recalibration. And recalibration only happens when people believe uncertainty has entered the room. That uncertainty doesn't come from one clip. It comes from accumulation. As the series progresses, the filmmakers revisit earlier testimonies not to repeat them, but to place them beside newly surfaced context. Statements that once felt isolated now sit next to timestamps, locations, and independent accounts that mirror the same dynamics. No one is labeled, no conclusions are drawn, but the alignment becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the documentary introduces one of its most unsettling ideas. Systems don't fail because of truth, they fail because of consistency. When the same behaviors repeat across years, across people who never met, across environments that were supposedly unrelated, coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. Former insiders explain how this consistency was masked for so long, not through conspiracies, but through fragmentation. Each story existed on its own island. One rumor here, one lawsuit there, one interview dismissed as bitterness. Without connection, nothing gained traction. The documentary's power comes from stitching those fragments together without commentary. And as those fragments align, the ripple effects expand outward. Brands begin to hesitate. Partnerships quietly pause. Not canceled pause. Appearances are reconsidered. Campaigns are restructured. No one issues statements explaining these shifts. They don't need to. In high-level entertainment, distance communicates everything. Legal analysts in the series explain why this stage matters more than public reaction. Courtrooms don't respond to outrage. They respond to patterns backed by corroboration. And once documentation enters the public record, even indirectly, it reframes how existing cases are viewed. Evidence that once seemed marginal becomes relevant. Testimony that felt anecdotal gains weight. This is where Sean Diddy Combs' position becomes more precarious, not because the documentary declares guilt, but because it changes context. Allegations that once existed separately now exist together. Silence that once signaled control now invites scrutiny. The margin for ambiguity narrows. The documentary is careful not to rush here. It slows down deliberately, introducing voices from legal and investigative backgrounds who explain how reevaluation works. Courts don't reopen cases because of documentaries. They reassess when new material reframes old evidence. And reframing doesn't require a smoking gun, it requires alignment. As this alignment becomes clearer, the series subtly widens its scope again, reintroducing Rick Ross not as a central figure, but as a reminder that proximity matters. Analysts explain that credibility in entertainment isn't only about what someone does, it's about how consistently their narrative holds under pressure. When new context emerges, even accurate statements can feel incomplete. Old interviews are replayed, not contradicted, contextualized. Comments about distance, independence, and association now sit beside a broader understanding of how influence circulated at the time. The documentary doesn't accuse Ross of wrongdoing. It shows how narratives, once stable, can shift when surrounding structures weaken. This distinction is important. The series repeatedly separates legal exposure from reputational gravity. Not everyone in a collapsing system collapses the same way. Some face courts, others face credibility tests. Both outcomes alter behavior. Behind the scenes, insiders describe a change in communication patterns. Conversations become shorter. Language becomes more cautious. Decisions that once moved quickly now stall under review. One executive describes it as operating with the brakes on. Nothing dramatic, just friction everywhere. And friction is dangerous in an industry built on momentum. The documentary then introduces a quiet but powerful moment. A legal expert explains how the release of one piece of material can change how all related material is handled going forward. Once something becomes public, thresholds shift. What was once considered too weak to pursue gets reevaluated. What was once dismissed as circumstantial gains relevance. This doesn't mean outcomes are guaranteed. It means processes restart, and that restart triggers movement. Former associates of Diddy describe how access changes during this period. Invitations stop arriving. Calls go unanswered. Intermediaries replace direct contact. Not exile insulation. The system doesn't collapse. It constricts, and constriction reveals where power actually lives. At the same time, the documentary shows how silence becomes more difficult to maintain. When questions are asked publicly, not answering becomes an answer. Media outlets don't accuse, they inquire. An inquiry has a way of pulling more material into the light. What's striking is how little the documentary needs to add at this stage. It lets reaction become content. Screenshots of postponed events, quotes from carefully worded statements that say nothing while saying everything. Analysts explain that this is how accountability often begins, not with verdicts, but with withdrawal. As this phase concludes, the viewer is no longer focused on what was revealed. Attention has shifted to what's now in motion. The system is adjusting. Legal mechanisms are waking up. Narratives are being re-examined. And hovering over all of it is a realization that changes the temperature of the entire story. Once reassessment begins, it doesn't stop where it started. It spreads. Because the most dangerous moment for any powerful figure isn't accusation, it's reevaluation. That's when old protections weaken. That's when silence stops working the way it used to. And that's when consequences, long deferred, begin to take shape. By the end of this section, the audience understands that the documentary didn't end with episode 4. It started something. And from here, the pressure doesn't rise loudly, it deepens. As the pressure deepens, the documentary shifts into its most consequential phase, where reassessment turns into formal movement. This is the point where the story leaves the cultural arena and enters institutional territory. The filmmakers make this transition carefully. No dramatic music, no countdowns, just a change in language. Terms like review, submission, evaluation, and procedural response begin appearing. Words that don't belong to social media, they belong to courtrooms. Legal analysts explain that when multiple strands of information begin aligning publicly, it creates something prosecutors pay attention to: contextual relevance. Evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. A single allegation may fail. A single recording may be disputed. But when narratives, documentation, and behavior patterns converge, prior decisions are no longer insulated. This is where Sean Diddy Combs' legal reality becomes heavier. The documentary outlines how existing matters surrounding Diddy are now being viewed through a different lens. Not because the documentary itself is evidence, but because it reframes evidence already on record. Allegations that once appeared disconnected now sit side by side. Statements that were once taken at face value are re-examined against newly visible timelines. Former prosecutors interviewed in the series explain it plainly. Courts don't need new accusations to revisit old ones. They need new understanding, and understanding is exactly what begins to form. The series shows how legal teams react when that shift happens. Motions are drafted cautiously. Language becomes precise. References to patterns of behavior replace isolated incidents. Submissions are no longer defensive, they're comparative. One attorney notes that the most dangerous moment for a defendant isn't indictment. It's when the narrative changes from what happened to how often it happened. At this stage, the documentary introduces one of its most sobering realizations. Time does not erase behavior, it archives it. Digital records don't forget. Old footage doesn't degrade. Statements made years apart can now be placed next to each other in seconds. What once required investigative resources now requires alignment. This is where the system begins catching up. Behind the scenes, insiders describe a shift from uncertainty to preparation. Legal advisors stop asking if something needs to be addressed and start asking how. Risk assessments are updated, exposure is recalculated, silence is no longer passive, it's strategic, and strategy has limits. The documentary contrasts this moment with earlier eras when influence could slow scrutiny indefinitely. That buffer is thinner now. Media ecosystems move faster, public records are more accessible, and once a story gains institutional attention, it doesn't rely on momentum, it relies on process. This is where the pressure intensifies. The filmmakers show how material that once sat on the edges of cases is pulled back into focus. Archived communications, previously dismissed testimony, old filings that didn't lead anywhere at the time, not because they were false, but because they lacked corroboration. Now, corroboration exists in context, if not in form. Legal experts stress an important distinction here. This doesn't guarantee outcomes. It guarantees reevaluation, and reevaluation is enough to alter trajectories. At the same time, the documentary revisits Rick Ross, not to escalate his role, but to show how proximity functions during legal shifts. Analysts explain that when institutions reassess one figure, they also reassess the ecosystem around them, not to assign blame, but to map influence. Associations that once seemed irrelevant are re-examined for relevance. Again, the documentary makes no accusations. It doesn't need to. It shows how credibility operates under scrutiny. When narratives are questioned, even neutral relationships can carry weight. Silence, once harmless, becomes noticeable. This phase of the story is quieter but heavier. There are no explosive revelations here, no dramatic clips. Instead, the documentary focuses on movement behind closed doors, meetings that last longer, reviews that take priority, decisions that are delayed pending clarity that hasn't arrived yet. One legal analyst describes it as the narrowing, the point where options disappear not because of guilt, but because of exposure. Once enough is visible, the system constrains itself. The series then introduces a key idea that reframes everything. Institutions don't act on outrage, they act on liability. And liability doesn't require proof beyond doubt. It requires risk beyond tolerance. That tolerance, according to multiple experts, has shifted. The documentary illustrates this through subtle indicators: court calendars adjusting, filings referencing broader context, language evolving from individual acts to sustained conduct. None of this is announced publicly. It doesn't have to be. Those who need to see it, And that's when the pressure becomes unavoidable. Former associates of Diddy describe a palpable change in access. The inner circle tightens. Communication funnels through intermediaries. Decisions that once required one approval now require several. This isn't collapse, it's containment. But containment signals recognition of threat. At the same time, the documentary highlights how public conversation begins to mirror institutional language. Media stops asking what happened and starts asking what comes next. Analysts discuss sentencing frameworks, procedural mechanisms, and judicial discretion. The story matures. This maturation matters. Because once a narrative matures beyond spectacle, it doesn't fade. It embeds. It waits. And when process aligns with pressure, outcomes follow paths that are difficult to reverse. By the end of this section, the viewer understands that the documentary is no longer the engine of the story. It's the catalyst. What's driving events now is institutional momentum, slow, methodical, and indifferent to celebrity. The most dangerous phase has begun. Not accusation, not exposure, but formal reconsideration. And once that begins, there is no returning to silence. From here, the story doesn't explode. It converges. The final movement of the documentary arrives without spectacle, and that is exactly what gives it weight. By this point, the story has moved beyond shock, beyond reaction, beyond even reassessment. What remains is consequence. Not the kind that trends for a weekend, but the kind that restructures how power functions after it's been exposed to sustained scrutiny. The filmmakers make a deliberate choice here. They stop showing clips, they stop revisiting footage. Instead, they focus on what changed after episode 4 aired and how quickly the atmosphere around Sean Diddy Combs shifted once the documentary finished saying everything it needed to say. Legal experts return, not to speculate, but to explain reality. They outline a principle that governs high-profile cases more than most people realize. Courts don't operate in isolation from context. They are insulated from public opinion, yes, but not from newly clarified patterns. When documentation, testimony, and behavior align across time, prior conclusions don't become invalid. They become incomplete. That distinction matters. The documentary emphasizes that no single episode, not even the fourth, functions as a verdict. What it does is force institutions to ask questions they can no longer avoid. Questions about scope, about duration, about whether earlier frameworks were sufficient to account for what is now visible. This is where the idea of finality begins to fracture. Former prosecutors explain that sentencing is not just about the crime charged, it's about the behavior demonstrated. If new material materially alters how that behavior means something, the system has mechanisms to respond. Rare mechanisms, serious mechanisms, but mechanisms nonetheless. The film never declares an outcome. It shows movement. Viewers are guided through how filings evolve when scrutiny reaches this level. Language tightens, references expand. What were once incidents become conduct. What were once allegations become corroborated narratives. Not because the documentary says so, but because legal review now demands it. For Sean Diddy Combs, the implications are unmistakable. The documentary notes that legacy once functioned as insulation. Cultural contribution, financial influence, and proximity to power created buffers. But buffers only work when silence holds. Once silence collapses, legacy becomes a variable, not a shield. Former associates speak cautiously in this final act. There is no celebration, no triumph, only acknowledgement, a recognition that the world they navigated for years no longer exists in the same form, that the rules have shifted, that protection has limits. Rick Ross appears briefly again, not as a focal point, but as contrast. Analysts explain that proximity to a collapsing narrative doesn't require wrongdoing to cause damage. It requires uncertainty. And uncertainty, once introduced, has consequences of its own. Reputations don't fall, they constrict. Opportunities don't disappear, they narrow. The documentary makes clear that this is not a story about villains and heroes. It is a story about systems responding to exposure. One of the most striking moments comes when a legal analyst says something deceptively simple. The system didn't fail. It worked the way it was designed to until the information environment changed. That line reframes everything. For decades, stories fragmented. Witnesses were isolated. Documentation was incomplete. Power relied on distance between facts. Episode 4 collapses that distance. It doesn't invent truth, it aligns it. And alignment is dangerous. The film returns to the idea of timing one last time, not as strategy, but as inevitability. Stories surface when conditions allow them to matter. December 16th wasn't important because it revealed something new. It was important because it arrived when denial could no longer sustain itself. By now, the audience understands something essential. Whether or not outcomes reach their maximum form, the ceiling has been removed. Silence is no longer effective. Fragmentation no longer protects. The machinery of reassessment has been activated, and that machinery doesn't rush. It processes. The documentary closes with reflection rather than prediction. Cultural commentators discuss what this moment represents beyond one man, beyond one case, beyond one platform. They talk about a shift from myth to documentation, from loyalty to accountability, from power assumed permanent to power examined continuously. There is no montage, no dramatic music swell, no declaration of victory, just a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible has occurred. For Sean Diddy Combs, the future remains legally complex and culturally transformed. The documentary does not claim to decide his fate, it shows how the conditions around his fate have changed. For the industry, the reckoning is broader. It is a warning that control over narrative is no longer exclusive, that time does not erase its records, and that silence, once the most reliable currency, now carries diminishing returns. The final words do not accuse. They conclude. They remind the viewer that exposure does not end stories, it redirects them. And once redirected, stories rarely return to where they began. Because the most powerful revelation of the reckoning isn't found in footage, audio, or testimony. It's found in the realization that the system functioned exactly as designed until alignment made avoidance impossible. And when that happens, consequences don't need to be announced, they unfold. If you watch this entire breakdown from start to finish, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence for ongoing documentary-level coverage where we track what happens after the headlines fade. And tell me in the comments, do moments like this permanently change how power operates, or does the system always find a way to protect itself again?